very much for doing this. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I'd like you to think back a little bit about people who had an influence on you as you were growing up and getting into your academic career, and the kinds of values that they imparted to you. Anything in particular come to mind as you think about that?
Well, one of my professors, when I did graduate study in particular, was George Shultz, who later went on to more visible and probably more auspicious activities, ending up as Secretary of State. And this was back in the late 50s or the mid-50s when I had just gotten out of service. And he certainly had a significant influence on the way I viewed the world. One, to understand the importance of letting the facts tell you what the conclusions properly are, rather than beginning by preconceptions and trying to understand other people's point of view. Both of us were what's known in the trade as labor economists, and at that time there was a heavy interest in wages, collective bargaining, and unions. So it was easy to begin with the conclusions and march inexorably through the facts to arrive at the place from whence you'd started. Most issues in labor relations are contentious, and the basic rule was always get both sides. And I think that served me in pretty good stead in the other things that I did in my life, being in government, and particularly the 15 years as a university president, where people are always approaching you with a mixture of zeal and righteousness that wasn't always justified by the facts. So I think that was a very important characteristic and value that was conveyed to me. Also, both George and, I hate to sound corny, my father, both projected a deep sense of personal integrity. That is, you weren't for sale. And your job in life was to try and adhere to a set of values, to recognize what's important in the community and in your life, and to stand by them. And I think both of those individuals and that set of values were particularly important to me.
How did they serve you well in leading the university?
Well, as I indicated, you know, everybody wants a piece of you. You're the president of the university, and in its mythical form, you preside over a community of scholars and students in earnest quest of truth. That's pretty far from what the real world is these days. People are always wanting you, basically on behalf of the institution, to take a position, particularly in areas which aren't directly related to the university's mission or your own competence in those notions. So I think you have to have your own internal compass and understand that people aren't coming to you because they think you're the reincarnation of Mahatma Gandhi or Winston Churchill, but because you stand for the institution. And there were a whole range of experiences. I remember, you know, most specifically, shortly after I came here, the great controversies associated with whether in the use of our endowment we should disinvest in companies which were doing business in South Africa. We took a position which was not particularly popular, that we wouldn't take that step. We would have certain parameters largely associated with something called the Sullivan Principles, but that at this point we had spent 150 years as a university trying to tell businessmen that they couldn't use their power to tell us what to teach and how to behave, and the converse was true. And I think there was also a parallel judgment that it didn't seem very productive to us to put pressure on the most progressive institutions in South Africa to withdraw when they were having a powerful egalitarian and democratizing impact. Rightly or wrongly, we took that position. It wasn't particularly popular. I think subsequent events indicated that it was probably right. Even statements of Nelson Mandela so specified. And if it wasn't right, it wasn't so at variance with what was considered appropriate that we should have adopted that position.
One of the things that I've learned from working at a university campus for going on 14 years now is universities operate on money.
Yeah.
Endowment, research activity,
right.
All of those things, grants, budgets. What were the particular challenges that you faced upon coming to Northwestern?
Well, first on your general point, you're correct, although that used to be our dirty little secret. You know, one of the constructive fictions that university has is that as an economic enterprise, they're somewhere between a commune and a 7-Eleven. And they really aren't complex economic institutions involving the allocation and strategic decisions concerning the resources. So, for example, at Northwestern, the budget is in excess of $700 million. Our endowment is $1.7 billion. The replacement value of our structures is about $1.5 billion, and those are non-trivial amounts. So if you're not going to be fixated on that, somebody should certainly keep count. A lot of that changed in the 80s when most institutions saw the end of what I call the great bull market in higher education, in which you'd seen hordes of young people come to the university, very generous support from alumni, state legislators, the federal government, the capacity to pass on outsized tuition increases, and all of that changed. We now had to behave and perform in an environment of, one, austerity, and two, where the public expectations were far more demanding to us. There was another contributing factor, and that was the rising cost of producing our goods, that is, education and the discovery of new knowledge. So it literally became true that when you'd hire a professor in molecular biology, which is one of the hot areas, didn't matter much whether you paid him $50,000 or $70,000. What mattered is if you paid $200,000 or $500,000 for a laboratory setup. So all of these things came together. It induced a dramatic change in the culture, put pressure on administrators up and down the line as different faculty groups understandably vied to protect their position or claim limited resources. Well, when I used to work for a living, I was an economist, and in the first class of the freshman economics course, you always say economics is that discipline which deals with the allocation of limited resources in the face of unlimited demands and wants. And that certainly describes the situation in the university.
One of the things I've always been fascinated by is how a person puts his or her stamp on an institution as much as they can during the time that they have stewardship
Right.
over it. How do you look upon your stewardship here at Northwestern?
Well, you know, time will tell, and I'm not really in the business of evaluating myself, although of course I do in the quiet of the night. When I came to Northwestern, it was and still is a fine institution. It was subject to the financial pressures that I've just described, and it's very peculiar. I've been at 4 institutions. Most universities say they're better than they are. And Northwestern was somewhat anomalous because I thought it was better than it gave itself credit for. So one of my tasks was to, in a sense, persuade the faculty and the students that this was the highest quality institution, and in so doing ratchet up their aspirations and expectations for themselves. Now, that sounds lofty, and to some extent it is, but once we got the financial problems under control, we were able to put resources into, for example, strengthening undergraduate instruction, building new initiatives in the life sciences, environmental sciences, the arts, and what have you. So I like to think that I gave the institution a greater sense of purpose and confidence about itself. But who knows? In relationship to the question you asked, it's an unusual thing when you become the president of an institution. I guess in corporate parlance, you're the CEO. You don't wake up in the morning and say, today I am a leader. Shall I be bureaucratic or charismatic? How am I going to do it? Essentially, you have to stay with what brought you there. And if it's a hard work, a sense of detail, taste and judgment, the role of the university president changes over the years. Used to be an aloof magisterial figure. In the 70s, he or she had to be a mediator and a peacemaker. Here you have to balance academic leadership against certain important managerial tasks. Another very important development while I was president, that in which I take a great deal of pride, was during the 80s, in order to compensate for some of these problems, there was an enormous run-up in the level of tuition, particularly in institutions such as Northwestern. And I think at one point in the late 70s or early 80s, we went up 17% a year. And this was tracking what was happening at other institutions. Well, in my judgment, a lot of that increase reflected a lack of discipline on the part of the administration and the trustees, a willingness to just pass on costs to the point of imprudence without understanding that university and colleges occupy a very privileged place in American society. And people give us money, the alumni support us, the legislature at least always gives us a hearing, even though we're a private institution. So when the university have a collateral...
Hang on, I wasn't rolling, I was ready, but I'm not.
Okay.
I am
Not that ready.
Not that ready. I am that ready now.
Okay. I thought in the university we had a collateral obligation to manage our affairs prudently and to take into account the impact of our decision on parents and family who are sacrificing so that their sons and daughters could avail themselves of education at a place like Northwestern and indeed many other institutions. So we set as a clear management goal to moderate our tuition increases. And when I came here, I don't mean to sound immodest, if you looked at the 25 major private institutions in the country, we had the 8th highest tuition. This is the Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago. And when I stepped down as president, we had the 24th highest. The only one that was lower was Rice in Texas, which has a very high ratio of endowment per student. That's not to say that tuition at Northwestern is at a bargain rate. It's still $16,500 a year. At other places, it's $19,000. And we try to make it possible to permit the best young people to come here regardless of need by providing very generous financial aid on a need-based basis. And in fact, 50% of our students are receiving some form of financial aid, and the average grant is in excess of $7,000 a year. So keeping control, not as an end in itself. I always said I didn't want to go down in history as the best accountant Northwestern ever had, but keeping control in order to protect the access of talented young people, particularly in Illinois and through the Midwest.
As you look toward the future, how are we doing as far as a society in protecting the assets of higher education as an entity for society?
Well, I think in the United States we're doing very well in general. It is true that we've gone through a period of limited resources, and we're still in it. But in my judgment, we should view this as an opportunity as much as a burden. Like any other institution, unions, businesses, when you don't have constraints and pressure, you tend to lose your focus. I guess the term in a market economy is you lose your competitive edge. Some of that has certainly went on in universities over the last 30 years. We probably reduced teaching loads for the faculty too much. We probably created a situation where many faculty saw their career largely in terms of research and not giving as much attention to teaching, although certainly there's a relationship between the two. So I think you're seeing a rebalancing. In fact, in the United States, we have a remarkable system. We have around 3,400 institutions of higher learning, including the community colleges. 50% or so of high school graduates attend some form of higher education. It has a wide diversity of choices in terms of small liberal arts courses to a place like the University of Illinois or a mega university in California and Minnesota. So I think higher education, although it's under stress, and it shouldn't enjoy any particular immunity from the stresses that are dealing with other institutions from the family up. But I think it's now in the process of carrying out constructive adaptations to this new environment. And I think all of us are committed to re-emphasizing undergraduate education, trying to get tuition under control, getting a better balance between teaching and research, and understanding that at the end, our strength is the confidence and support of the public at large, beginning with our alumni and going to the people of the state and the country. And that's often painful, but some pain might be necessary.
In your address to the Lincoln Academy, you had some things to say about opportunity in education and how that how grateful you were to be able to take advantage of those opportunities.
Right. Well, since I was trained as a social scientist, I know you shouldn't extrapolate from a single experience, but I've always felt very grateful for the opportunity that higher education provided for me. I grew up in New York City in a working class family. Nobody had ever gone beyond the 8th grade, and through an improbable set of circumstances, I ended up at the University of Illinois. I remember that first year I paid the terrible sum of $80 in tuition, which took care of the tuition, and I had an opportunity to work at that time. And in a very profound sense, it changed my life. It didn't hand things to me on a platter, but it broadened my horizons, and it gave me a great sense of opportunity and choice that's so important to personal development and your own career progression. So I'm very grateful to the University of Illinois in general and to higher education.
And it seems like it's come full circle in that you've spent a large part of your life working in service of higher education to give others opportunity.
Right. Well, maybe that's so. I didn't plan it that way, but I'm glad it worked out that way.
Certainly. I would like to ask one other thing as we come to the end. I've asked this of all the laureates. This is quite an august group of people that you're associated with now in terms of the honor that's been bestowed upon you. What were your reflections upon being named the Lincoln Laureate?
Well, I think my first reaction was surprise. I was generally familiar with the illustrious people who had been given this honor, and then, of course, a sense of great appreciation, and particularly in my case, because I'm an adopted son of Illinois. I don't think people link Champaign-Urbana with the Bronx very easily in terms of geographical juxtaposition or culture. And I came out here. My wife, I met her at the University of Illinois. She comes from a farm and grew up on a farm. My kids were born here after I finished and came back from service. I was on the faculty of the University of Chicago. I went to government. I had an interlude as president of the University of Colorado. And then I came back for the last 10 years in Northwestern. People always expressed a sense of befuddlement. And they said, "What, you left Colorado?" And they all have in mind this mystical concept of the high mountains and sort of the feel-good environment that they think is present there. And Colorado is a great state, but I always thought Illinois was more congenial to me because it reflected a set of values of work and honesty and opportunity that I saw more manifest here, and which were so important in my own life. So I was very grateful to have my name linked with Lincoln. I don't think anybody would have, who knew me, would have had that expectation. So when the governor put that ribbon around my neck, I think it was a rare moment.
Is there anything that you think you might like to add?
No, it's up to you. It's fine.
I think we did it. It's fine.
Okay, good.
I'd like to do some cut